Before we begin, let me give you a taste of what lies ahead. Picture the dimly lit confines of an early morning bakery. Flour dust hanging in the air and an inexplicable metallic voice echoing through the speakers, getting louder, closer and more distinct with each passing day. And then imagine a shadowy presence that just stands out of reach, looming over a terrified baker while the only lights in the building flicker and die. This is the kind of story that makes you question what lingers in the dark corners of London, and I assure you, once you hear it, you will never forget. Felix here. Today is Thursday, November 7th, 2024, and I hope you've been keeping well. It's been quite an eventful week here in the archives. The intern's been sorting out old records. It's always a delight to see how enthusiastic he gets, even the smallest details. And yes, I've come back from a short break, but no rest for the wicked, as they say. We're heading into some unsettling territory today, and I think it's going to be one of those stories that lingers with you long after you hear it. This one was sent in by one of our field operatives who got the exact details straight from the horse's mouth. It's eerie, unnerving, and exactly what you would expect when dealing with the secrets that linger in London's forgotten corners. So, without further ado, let's dive in. This takes us back to the summer of 2012, when the Olympics were bringing in crowds from all over the world. You'd expect Hackney to be bustling, but instead it was strangely quiet, almost deserted, except for a handful of lost tourists. It was into this eerie quiet that Glenn White, a bread delivery driver, found himself driving each morning before dawn, working for a small sourdough bakery in Hackney Wick. The bakery itself was nothing remarkable from the outside, just another warehouse unit, but what happened inside was far from the ordinary. The air inside of the bakery was thick with the scent of yeast, flour, and the lingering warmth of the ovens. The place had a distinct atmosphere, a mix of comforting bakery aromas and an underlying, almost metallic tang that hinted at something less benign. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cold, harsh glow that could barely reach into the shadowy corners, giving the entire place an unsettling feeling. Glenn would start at 4 a.m. He would fire up the coffee machine, scavenge for leftovers from yesterday's bake, and load up the bread float, a nickname for the electric delivery van. The night baker, Carla, would usually be there before him, her music drifting out from inside. Unsettling noise tracks that seemed almost designed to make the solitary building at 3 a.m. feel more haunted. The sound of it was weirdly fitting, and Glenn couldn't shake the feeling that the music suited Carla somehow, as if she too carried a haunting weight about her. Carla often looked pale and tired, like the shadows had already claimed part of her. At first, Glenn figured it was just the nature of night work, but eventually she confided in him. There was something strange about the bakery's sound system. They had an iPad set up to control the speakers throughout the space, but sometimes the music would just stop, cutting out abruptly, and then came in other sounds. Clanging, metallic, rhythmic. At first, it was distant, almost like a murmur, but each time it had happened over the months, it had grown louder, more distinct. The air would grow colder when these sounds started, the warmth of the ovens seeming to vanish as if the heat itself was drained away. Carla tried to turn the iPad off. She even unplugged the speakers entirely, but the noise kept coming. And the worst part? It wasn't just random noise. Carla swore it sounded like voices, like someone or something was trying to speak. Not in a language she recognized, but low, grating metallic words, twisted beyond comprehension. Glenn, of course, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was interference. Maybe flour had gotten into the equipment. But he knew, deep inside, the way Carla's eyes darkened when she spoke about that, it wasn't as simple. One morning, Glenn finally heard it for himself. The bakery was dimly lit, the smell of fresh bread mingling with that ever-present metallic tang. And then, just as he'd come back from a delivery run, he noticed something was wrong. There was this thick, acrid smell in the air. The ovens were burning, black smoke leaking from the edges. The oppressive scent of the scorched bread filled his nostrils, clinging to the back of his throat. He rushed in, trying to switch them off, pulling open the doors, but he couldn't stop the smoke from spreading, the cracking of burnt loaves echoing through the empty bakery, and the sense of unease settled over him. Where was Carla? And that's when Glenn looked up into the bakery's makeshift office. It was a little platform built halfway up the interior wall with a flimsy wooden frame around it. Usually it had a dim glow from the PC screen that was always left on, but now the light flickered. It's in fits and starts. Carla was standing up there, staring into the screen, completely still and silent. And that's when Glenn noticed something else. There was a shadow beside her, something just out of the reach of the light. Not a person, but a presence, a shifting, barely visible outline that seemed to loom over her. And that's when the metallic voice came in, louder and louder, grating and echoing around the empty bakery, blending with the flickering light of the PC. It was as if the entire room pulsed with the noise, and then the walls themselves vibrating with each harsh syllable. Glenn shouted her name. Carla! His voice echoing off of the concrete walls. And that's when Carla turned, her eyes wide and hollow, her hands jerking out as if to push something away. The light snapped. The entire bakery plunged into darkness, and then silence. Complete, unnerving silence. Carla walked down the stairs, her expression blank, as though she'd just woken up from a nightmare that she couldn't quite remember. Her footsteps were heavy, echoing off the metal steps, each one filled with a dreadful finality. Glenn couldn't bring himself to ask what she had just seen, or who or what had been up there with her. And Carla? Well, she didn't offer any explanations, simply moved on, ignoring him, turning back to her work like nothing had ever happened. But of course something had happened, Glenn knew that much. There was a small window high on the far wall, the only source of natural light when the shutters were closed. When Glenn had arrived that morning, the sun had been up. But when he looked at the window while Carla came down those stairs, there was nothing. Like the outside world had ceased to exist. Not very long after that, as you can probably imagine, Glenn quit. He found himself a new job. He left the bread float behind and moved on with his life. He never saw Carla again. He never even dared to look at the bakery again. And not too long after that, that bakery in Hackney Wick closed, and the entire building was torn down. It was as if the developers wanted to erase any trace of whatever had happened in there. It's hard to say exactly what went on in the dark. However, there are whispers that talk of entities that feed on isolation, that seep into the cracks of our world in places where time seems to stretch thin. It's hard to say what exactly went on in that dark, flour-dusted space. But there are whispers. Talks of entities that feed on isolation, that seep into the cracks of our world in places where time seems to stretch thin. I guess if I had to classify it, and I do have to classify it, I think I'll put it under Class 5 sentient residual entity. A manifestation that, while not necessarily malevolent, feeds on the energy around it. A residual haunting that somehow gained awareness. The kind of things that find solace in the dark, forgotten places, and grow stronger with each frightening glance, each whispered fear. If you ever find yourself alone in an old bakery, and you hear something that sounds like metal scraping, well, I guess it's best to leave the bread where it is and walk away. For now, this account will be logged under section Epsilon 3 of the archives. Recordings of auditory phenomena like hauntings. And if you're listening to this, remember, the strange and uncanny have ways of finding those who aren't looking for them. The air might feel colder, the shadows might seem deeper. But, my friends, always trust your instincts. Stay safe, everyone, and until next time, keep your wits about you. Felix out.